Okay, we are on 34b1 Lamed Daled Amad Beis, and we are asking further questions. Rav Yochanan on Reish Lakish. Rav Yochanan challenged Reish Lakish from the following question: Nitma osh nifsal habasar. Let's say you had meat of an offering which became tameh or became invalidated, or it went out of the azar. So you shecht an animal, you slaughtered an animal, and then it becomes tameh or becomes invalidated. We'll have to define what invalidated means in a moment. Or the animal was now brought outside of the courtyard. Eliezer Omer Yizror. Eliezer says that you still throw the blood. Rabbi Shua Omer Lo Yizror, you should not throw the blood. Rabbi Shua Zarak, and Rabbi Shua says you shouldn't do it. If you did, Hortza, then the carbon is still accepted. My nifsal. What does it mean when the Torah says, when the Mishnah says, that it is that the animal was invalidated? Lav hesef das. We're not talking about invalidation of inattention. So imras b'shlom absuli tumahave. If you want to say the concern is that the possibility of becoming tamei, hain mishkachas l'namratz tzitz. That's why that everyone agrees that if at the end of the day you sprinkle the blood, it's okay. Why? Because there's the tzitz. Okay, let's take a step back. There's something called the tzitz. The tzitz is something the Kohen Gadol wears on his forehead, and the Torah tells us it brings about atonement. What does it bring atonement for? So it brings atonement for things which are invalidations, but not intrinsic invalidations. Okay, so let's say if someone has the wrong intention before bringing a carbon, like pigul, the tzitz doesn't work. But if there's lower levels, like lower levels of invalidation, the tzitz works. So we're saying if the psul, if the invalidation was because maybe became tameh, then we can understand that the tzitz actually, then even Rabbi Shua said you shouldn't do it, he'll agree that if you sprinkle the blood, it's going to work. If you want to tell me that's intrinsic, the tzitz should not work. So my nifsal, Gemara says no, it doesn't mean nifsal, it wasn't invalid because of inattention, rather nifsal b'tzvul yom, it was tameh because, it was invalid because it came into contact with someone who was tameh on like a lower level. Gemara says yihachi hanu tameh. The first case that Bryce already said, someone is tameh, and then it said someone who is, then it's or it's invalid. So if you're tameh, now there's two examples of tameh. The Gemara says, yeah, Trey Gavin and tameh. The Bryce is talking about two different examples of tameh. Okay, Kisalik Rabbi. Now we go back to the discussion we had the other day, which was about the truma tameh that was buried and it came back, and we had the interpretation saying that it's going to be it's not good because there was inattention. So Gemara says Kisalik Ravin came from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael. Amar l'shmaitik made Rav Yirmiyah. He repeated this teaching of Rav Sheshes before Rav Yirmiyah. Amar Rav Yirmiyah said, Bavlai Tipshai, the Babylonians are foolish people. Why? Mishum diyasu ba'ar chashucha, they live in a dark land. Bavel was a valley. Okay, they say murky teachings. Had they not heard the teaching of Rav Shimon Lakish, son of the name of Yoshia? What is that? Okay, so in a few days it's going to be Sukkot. It's hard to believe, but in a few days it's going to be Sukkot. And on Sukkot there was an offering that was brought on the base of Mikdash where there was water that was consecrated, that was used for pouring on the base on the mizbeach. Normally, every day of the year there is wine libations. On Sukkot there are water libations. Okay, so the halacha is if the water became tameh, so what you do is you kind of you could purify the water. How do you do so? You allow it to come into contact with a mikvah, and then it's able to become pure. But as we'll see, there's a caveat. So again, let's say the water of the festival became tameh. Let's say a person took the jug, put it into a mikvah. Okay, put the water in the jug into the mikvah, then the water and you allow the water to come into direct contact with the water, it becomes pure. Okay, but that's only if you consecrated it afterwards. Tahor, and then it's dar. Let's say a person consecrated the water, say it's going to be used for nisuch hamayim, for this offering, for this service, and then the person brought it into the mikvah, tamim, it doesn't work. Michti, let's see. Zriyaninu. Ultimately, conceptually, what's this idea of putting the water into the water? It's really a form of replanting. Okay? If the idea is replanting works to rejuvenate, to bring about a pure state, then who cares if I first sanctified it and then put it in, or I did vice versa, doesn't matter. Alma ain't really hektish. So what you see, it's really just a chumrah, it's really just stringency. Once something becomes holy, once something becomes sanctified, then Chazal or sages came along and said, technically, theoretically, it should work that once the water comes into contact with the other water, then it's going to be purified. But since I already made it hektish, since I already sanctified it, and I designated for the base of Mikdash, it's not going to work. So hachinami here too, and truma. That's what the Brisa, the initial Mishnah was telling me. The Mishnah Truma was telling me that when a person goes ahead and plants truma, it's already truma, and it's tameh. And okay, really replanting something should make it pure, but the galacha is no. If it's not truma, then you can make the tuma go away because there's no problem, because really replanting something is like it's new. But once it already is truma, then no one's allowed to eat it. And the Kohen's allowed to eat it because it still maintains its truma status. It's a rabbinic elevation, stringency that is placed in. Yasser Rav Dimi B'Karmel Lahala Shmai L'Shmai Tamar Le'Abaya Hikdish Mechlik Amar. Does Rabbi Yoshia mean to say that that where a person sanctified it in the utensil, right? There's two steps to sanctification. One is I could say this water is going to be used for a pure purpose. Others, I put it in the utensil that is going to be used for the Beis Hamikdash. So when Rav Oshia said that the rabbis made this elevated stringency, were they talking about where the person consecrated the water in a vessel? But let's say the person just consecrated it orally, just said this water is going to be used, but they didn't put it in the utensil for the Beis Hamikdash. Maybe the rabbis were not strict there, or maybe they also did so when the person just said it with their mouth. 34b3 Amarle Zula Shmati says I don't have a direct. I never heard this question directly. But I heard something similar. Let's say a person has grapes that became tamei. Let's say a person presses them, and then afterwards the juice comes out. A person goes ahead and consecrates them. Tahorim, the juice is tahar. Okay, but let's say they were already consecrated grapes, and then the person pressed them. Tmeim, they're tamei. So basically, you see from the Vahanav Mikdushas Peninu, Rav Dimi concludes. Now the grapes are only going to acquire oral consecration because there's no utensil to place grapes in. In other words, grapes are never part of an avoda, and therefore there's no klei sharis, there's no sanctified utensil, as opposed to the nisach haman, you put it in the water in the jug that's going to be used to pouring. With grapes, there's no such thing. And yet you see that that if they first become tamei, they first are hukdash, they're first consecrated, and then they become tamei, then squeezing out a little bit will not remove the tumas. You see, even when it's orally consecrated, it's still that rabbinic stringency still applies. Rav Yosef rejects this, and I'm Amres. Maybe we're talking about grapes that are truma. The Kedusha's Pedid who? Kedusha's Klidamya, which their oral consecration is identical to Kachim's consecration in a vessel. Okay, in other words, when it comes to Truma is something which is given to Kohen. It's never put in a utensil, and therefore the highest level is always going to be oral consecration, and therefore maybe the rabbis always said the highest level of consecration, that's where we're going to apply the stringency. So for Truma, the highest level of consecration is always going to be oral, but when it comes to Kachim, which has a higher level of putting in a utensil, maybe they only applied it at the highest level. Things which have to go into a vessel, but maybe the rabbis did not impose stringency when it's just consecrated orally. Now the Gemara just elaborates a little bit on the same. Rav Yochanan said if a person presses the grapes, if they weren't made sanctified, or they weren't made into truma before they become tamei. They weren't made into truma. Even though a person presses quite a lot, it's still going to be tar. Ask the Gemara, Rav Yochanan really say this? Rav Yochanan, we learned a few days ago. If grapes become tamei, dorchan pachas bachas megabeitza, you have to only squeeze them less than a beitza, because once it's a beitza size, then it's going to cause tuma. So Gemara says two answers. First of all, it could be Rav Yochanan said you squeeze them. He was talking about less than an olive volume. If you we're talking about a case where the grapes came into contact with the person that is the initial case where Yochanan said it has to be done less than a beitza is because the grapes came into contact with the person that was a rishon. Therefore, the grapes are a second degree of tuma. 34, hacha dinagu b'sheni, and therefore the grapes are sheni, come into contact with the grape juice, which would be able to contract tuma, because second degree tuma is able to cause something else to become tummy. However, hacha, but here in the second case of Rav Yochanan, and Rav Yochanan's talking over here is the grapes come into contact with a second degree tuma, davelu shlishi. The grapes therefore are now a third degree, and a third degree is not able to cause something else to become tummy. Okay, so basically what comes out is that we see there are stringencies that are placed that by kachim, by truma, that the rabbis don't allow, basically stringencies that are placed in these regarding these halachas. Now we're going to see a couple of examples of other stringencies that are placed regarding sanctified things. So Amarava, we also see such a concept of stringencies like this. Okay, totally different case, but basically you have the water of from the paraduma, so it's the ashes of the red heifer mixed together with water. Where does the water come from? So the pasuk says you should place the ashes, living water, into a vessel. So what do you see from there? Chiyusan bakli, that the water comes directly, the vessel gets filled from the water directly from the spring itself. However, v'nasan, the pasuk also says that he shall place the water into a vessel. By saying I placed it into it, that means I'm pouring it. That means it's no longer in the spring. It's detached. But with the Brisa said above that it has to be attached. Rather, what you say from here is that there is elamala. Rather we see with Lamed Hey Amud Aleph 35a1 that there is a stringency imposed by the rabbis that says the vessel, even though the pasuk says v'nasan, which means that really doesn't have to be from the spring itself. I could pick up a cup, I could get some water out and then pour the water in. But since we're talking about something which is very sanctified, we're going to have a stringency and say, no, you can't even do that. The water has to come from within the spring itself. Another case, on the seventh day of his waiting period, goes to the mikvah and comes out of the mikvah. So they have 7 days. The guy goes to the mikvah on the seventh day. Okay, he's allowed to have meiser. Once the sun goes down, then he's allowed to eat ochel b'truma. He's allowed to eat truma. B'truma and b'kachim lo. He's allowed to truma, but he can't have sacrifices. Ask the Gemara, why can he sacrifices? He's completely pure. So rather, the idea is that it's a stringency. Here too, it's a stringency. Okay, here too, we have this. So it goes back to support this notion that there are stringencies when it comes to truma and other holy things. So Rabashi, last case, pasuk talking about a shlamim offering, and the pasuk says that the meat, only someone who's tar is allowed to eat the meat. But it says the word vav, vehabasar, and the meat. The rabbis says that eitzim levana to include that wood that is used to burn the carbon and frankincense of kachim. Those are things that are going to be subject to the tuma of foods, which is not the norm, because normally there are two types of things which are able to come tameh. Those are foods, those are utensils, but not just like firewood and not frankincense. Eitz mavana b'nei itzmuininu are frankincense and wood, things which are subject to tuma of foods. They're not inedible. Rather it's an elevated stringency. Achinami mala. Here too, when it comes to the by truma, there are rabbinically imposed stringencies. Okay, and that is the support to the halacha that Rav Yirmiyah quoted from Rav Reish Lakish, tell you that the reason that the truma that was buried is going to truma is going to be buried still can be eaten because of an extra stringency by truma, which we now find a lot of precedent for. Okay, God willing, tomorrow we're going to pick up and talk about some of the different types of ingredients that we use to make matzah. Have a great day.